In this module, I'm going to show you how you can plot your data using the graph builder in JMP. So I'll demonstrate that with the trout experiment data that I showed in the first module. So in this data set, I have two variables. One is just telling me which treatment I'm using, and the other one tells me the response, the hemoglobin content. So I would maybe like to visually see how the hemoglobin values change as I do different sulfamirazine. So one way of doing this, and which I always recommend, is to start by just doing a graphical representation of the data. So if I click on the graph option at the top, there's a lot of different options for different types of plots that you can make depending on what type of data you have. I usually just go ahead and start with the graph builder because you can make all sorts of graphs with this, and you can do it interactively by dropping variables and variables in and out. So when you click on this window opens up and you have a lot of different options. Let me just modify this a little bit so I can get it all in the window. There's a lot of drop down openings available for you to put your variables, which are over here on the left, your list of variables. So you have a Y column, so you can put your Y variable there. This will be what's on the Y axis. You have your X, which will be your X axis. You have a group by Y, you have a group by X, you have an overlay. So there's lots of different ways you can visually represent your data. So all we have available right now is something relatively straightforward, but we'll see how we can make stuff more complicated when we look at factorial experiments. So if I just want to look at how hemoglobin changes depending on sulfamirazine, then I'm going to do this by clicking and dragging sulfamirazine down to X. And so what this first starts to show you is all of these points correspond to a row in our original data set. In fact, if I hover over it, it'll tell me exactly which row it's plotting. Now, right now, there's no real order to how these points show up because they're just there's no y-axis right now. So they've just kind of jittered the points so you can see all the points that are there. So if I want to order these points by their hemoglobin amount, I just click and then drag hemoglobin down to the Y, and I get a plot that looks like this. So for example, for those trout that had 0 sulfamirazine in their food, their hemoglobin rates varied from about 5.5 to about almost 9. But when I look at 5, it goes from 6.5 to 12. So you can really see a lot of the data very quickly, since JMP by default will plot all the points individually. One thing you might want to add to see maybe some overall trends is you can add kind of a smooth trend line to all of these points. So one way you can do that is click on this option right here, which will take an average moving across from left to right. So you can kind of get an idea of what the average trend is. If you actually wanted it to fit like a hard mean at each point, so it just takes the mean of each category, then all you would need to do is click on this line right here, and it will get rid of the points when you do this. And so all this is done is it's plotting the mean at each individual point. If I wanted to maybe add some standard error bars at each location, you can just go to this error bars option, and they have a couple different options you can do. So maybe I just want to do the standard error, and it adds little standard error bars to it, so you can kind of get an idea of what the variation is for each of these means. If you wanted to maybe make these lines a little bit thicker, then you just need to right click, go to graph, and then line width scale. I guess you can't see that on this video, but you can then move down to the different sizes like 3, and it'll make the lines a little bit thicker. As far as being able to copy and paste this into a document, what I would recommend that you do is maybe you click on Done first, so it kind of simplifies the plot. You can also change the titles by clicking on it, and you can write maybe a simpler plot for this. There's a little bit of freedom that you can. So how you copy and paste this into a document depends on whether you have a Mac or a PC. For a Mac, you have these sort of options right here. And so I just click on this selection tool, hold down my shift key, and then start selecting things that I want to copy and paste. And so I could just right click, hit copy, and then open up a Word document and paste it if I wanted to do something like that. For Windows users, it's going to be a little bit more complicated. There's actually sort of a hidden way that you can copy and paste on your Graph Builder window. If you hover your mouse right around this location, some other options will show up, and then that's where you'll see your selection toolbar. So hopefully you can figure that out. It's kind of difficult because you have to hover it, and it's not immediately clear what you need to do. So that's one way you can do the Graph Builder. So let's go back. So I'm going to click on this red arrow and go to Show Control Panel to go back to my original window. So let me go back to my original plot. So let me just go back to these points. So one thing that's really cool about Jump is how interactive it is. So let's say that I see these points and maybe I think that this point looks like it's an outlier. And so I don't want to have to kind of cycle through the data myself to try to figure out where that point is. I can actually highlight it in the Graph Builder, and then if I go back to my data set, it highlights the row where that came from, which is actually really, really useful. I could also say maybe I just want to care about this set of points, so I could just click and drag this range, and then again it'll highlight the ones that I want. And that's a really useful feature for data exploration, and one reason why I like the Graph Builder so much. So this is just a quick introduction to the Graph Builder. I highly recommend that you play around with it and see the different things that you can do. For example, they have a box plot option, they have a histogram option, just to see how these different options work.